Montana Territory, September 1882. The clatter of iron wheels echoed off the cold depot walls as the northbound train hissed and groaned, readying to leave Miles City. Bria Bellamy stood stiff beside the station master's desk, her arms locked around her 6-year-old son, Oliver, while her daughter, Olivia, clung to the back of her skirts. The station master didn't look up. "Train leaves in 10 minutes, Miss Bellamy. I am sorry. The debt has gone unpaid too long." The county orphanage in Helena agreed to take the children. "You will be sent to the women's work camp in Butte. That's the law." Bria's throat burned. "I just need until the end of the week. I have a job lined up at the dressmaker's in town." "I can pay the boarding house what I owe. They have already filed the papers, Miss Bellamy. There's nothing more I can do." Oliver's small hand clutched hers tighter. "Mama, I do not want to go without you." She knelt and kissed his forehead, heart splitting in two. "I know, sweetheart. I know." The door slammed open behind them, boots hitting the wood floor hard. She turned, startled. A tall man stepped through, dusty from the trail, his hat pushed back just enough to show a strong jaw and pale green eyes set deep with worry. "Tobias Hartley," he said, voice low but steady. "I will cover whatever she owes, every cent." The station master blinked. "And you are, not your concern, how much?" The man's gaze didn't leave Bria's face. The years dropped away in a blink. She knew that voice, that look. She had not seen him in 7 years, not since the war ended and he rode out of Missouri without a word. "Tobias," she whispered. He reached into his coat and pulled out a leather pouch, dropping it on the desk. "Count it." The station master opened the pouch, eyes wide as he swept the coins and bills across the table. "This is more than enough." "Then tear up her papers," Tobias said. Bria stood slowly, still holding her children close, her heart pounding loud enough to drown out the train's whistle. "Tobias, why would you? You are not getting sent anywhere," he said, voice rough but not unkind. "Not while I can stop it." The station master cleared his throat. "This clears her debts to the boarding house. Children stay with her. And she is no longer under court order." He looked at the train conductor. "Hold the train. This family is not going." Bria's knees buckled and Tobias caught her with one arm, steadying her without hesitation. He looked down at the 2 children, then back at her. "You have kids," he said. "I do," she replied, her voice shaking. "Oliver and Olivia," he crouched, looking the boy in the eye. "You like horses, Oliver?" Oliver nodded. "Yes, sir." "That is good. I have 4 of them." Bria stared at him. "Why are you here?" "I was buying supplies," he said. "Stopped in town and heard someone at the cafe say a woman was being sent off because she missed a payment, with 2 kids. They said your name." She swallowed hard. "So you paid my debt, just like that." "I owed you more than I can ever repay," he said simply, standing again. "I never forgot you, Bria." He turned to the station master. "Is she free to leave?" "She is." Tobias held out his hand. "Come on, let us get you home." Bria hesitated, looking down at her children, then up at the man who once stole her heart and vanished like smoke. She placed her hand in his. Tobias led them out of the station, his long stride steady, protective. Outside, the wind had picked up, leaves skittering across the dirt road. His horse was tied just beyond the platform, a tall bay gelding with a well-worn saddle and supplies strapped behind. "What about you?" she asked. "Where do you live?" "North of the river bend. About an hour's ride. I have a cabin." He looked at her. "And it is yours now, too, if you want it." Bria blinked, stunned. "I do not expect anything," he said quickly. "I just want you safe and the kids. That is all." She looked down at Oliver and Olivia. They were quiet now, watching him with wide eyes. Olivia reached for Tobias' hand. He took it gently. "You remembered me," Bria said softly. "I never stopped," he replied. They rode out of the town together, Tobias leading the horse while Bria sat in the saddle with Olivia in front and Oliver behind her, his small arms wrapped around her waist. Tobias walked beside them, quiet but sure, his presence steady as the mountains in the distance. By the time they reached his homestead, the sun had dipped low, casting golden light over the hills. The cabin stood tucked in a grove of pine, smoke curling from the chimney. A corral held his horses, and behind the house, a small garden lay fading into autumn. He opened the door for them as if it had always been theirs. Inside, the warmth of the fire wrapped around her like a blanket. Tobias set 2 extra plates on the table, then pulled out a trunk and laid out blankets for the children. "You can take my bed," he said. "I will sleep on the floor." Bria shook her head. "We will figure it out." He met her gaze across the room. "You are not a burden, Bria," she bit her lip. "I do not know what to say." "You do not have to say anything yet," he said, voice soft. "Just rest, you and the kids. I will be here in the morning." The children curled up on the bed, fast asleep within minutes. Bria stood at the window, looking out at the stars, her arms folded around herself. Tobias came to stand beside her, not touching her, just close enough that she could feel the heat from his skin. "I never meant to leave like I did," he said quietly. "The war took everything out of me. I did not think I had anything left to offer you." "I thought you were dead," she whispered, "and then I thought you just stopped loving me." He turned to her then, his voice breaking. "I never stopped." She looked up at him, and for a long moment neither of them moved. Then she reached for his hand. "Thank you," she said. He brought her hand to his chest, holding it there. "You are safe now. And I will make sure you never have to feel that kind of fear again." Bria nodded, her eyes stinging with tears. "I believe you." Outside, the wind quieted. Inside, the fire burned low. And in the stillness of that Montana night, something long lost began to come back to life. Morning brought a dull light through the small paned window, gray with a low cloud ceiling. Bria stirred first, the warmth of Olivia's back pressed against her chest, Oliver curled near her legs. She stayed still for a moment, letting the quiet wrap around her. No shouting, no hasty packing, no looming train. Just the creak of logs expanding in the cool air and the far-off sound of a wood axe striking. She eased herself from the bed, careful not to wake the children. Her feet found the floorboards, cold but solid beneath them. She crossed to the window. Outside, Tobias swung the axe in a steady rhythm, splitting thick rounds from a fallen pine stacked nearby. His shirt sleeves were rolled to the elbow, his hair still damp from river water. A wool shirt lay slung across a rail, untouched by the morning chill. She turned from the window and found a folded dress and apron set near the hearth, clean and mended. A tin comb rested beside it, and a shallow wash basin had been filled. She hadn't asked for any of it, but it was there all the same. When she stepped outside, Tobias paused mid-swing. He set the axe aside slowly, brushing his palms on his trousers. "I found a dress of my sister's," he said. "She left it here years ago, thought you might need something fresh." Bria looked down at the apron. "She lived here, not for long. She stayed a few months after her husband passed. Then she remarried and went to Billings." She nodded, quiet. Tobias motioned toward the barn. "I've got a dairy cow that needs milking and hens that won't feed themselves. You feel up to walking?" "I do," she said. "What about the children?" "They're still sleeping." "I'll hear them if they wake." Inside the barn, the scent of hay and cedar wood surrounded them. A red hen clucked from the rafters. Tobias moved with sure steps through the space, untying the cow and guiding her to the stall without much fuss. Bria watched him for a moment. "Why didn't you write?" He didn't look up right away. "I kept meaning to, but after the war, I didn't think anything I could say would make up for what I didn't do. You could have said you were alive." "I should have." He finally met her eyes. "I thought about you every day. But I figured you'd moved on. I didn't think I had any right to come back." She reached for the wooden bucket settling beside the cow. "You were wrong," she said. He nodded without speaking. When they returned to the house, Oliver was awake, sitting at the table with a wool blanket draped around his shoulders. Olivia stood near the hearth, rubbing her eyes. "I thought you were gone," Oliver said. "I just stepped outside," Bria told him, brushing his hair back. "You're safe." Tobias set a tin plate on the table. "There's cornbread and eggs. I'll make another pot of coffee." Olivia tugged at his sleeve. "Do you have a cat?" "No cat here," he said, crouching to her height. "But I've got a dog who comes around sometimes. He's half wild and doesn't like to be touched, but he keeps the foxes away." She nodded solemnly, as if this were a pact. After breakfast, Tobias brought out a long-handled hoe and a sack of seed. "Frost's not far off," he said, "but we can get beets and onions in before it sets hard." "You mind helping me?" Bria didn't hesitate. "I used to keep a kitchen plot." He handed her the sack. "So did my mother, said it kept her from going mad when the world felt too big." They worked the soil side by side, the children stacking flat stones into imaginary castles nearby. The wind carried the scent of pine sap and damp earth, and the sky stayed low, but it didn't rain. At midday, Tobias paused and leaned on the hoe. "You ever think about leaving Missouri?" "I couldn't," she said. "My husband's people were there. And then it was just me and the children." He looked toward the hills. "There's space out here, enough to start over." She followed his gaze. "I don't know what starting over looks like anymore." Tobias didn't push her. He simply handed her a tin cup of water and said, "You've already started. You're planting something new." That night, they sat on the porch after the children had gone to bed, a blanket tucked around their shoulders against the chill. Tobias lit his pipe, the smoke curling upward in thin ribbons. Bria folded her hands in her lap. "You were always quiet," she said. "I was listening." "To what?" "The way you used to hum when you sewed. The way your laugh got caught halfway when you were trying not to be unkind." She turned her face toward him. "You remembered that?" "I remember everything." They sat without speaking for a long while. The wind rustled the pine needles. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called. Bria laid her hand lightly over his. "I don't know how to trust again, Tobias." He didn't move. "You don't have to tonight, just sit here with me," and she did. The first frost came overnight. Bria stepped out barefoot at dawn, her toes curling instinctively against the porch boards as she looked out at the thin crust of ice glazing the water barrel. Pale light crept across the ridge, catching on the brittle grass beyond the fence. She wrapped her shawl tighter and turned as the door behind her opened. "You'll freeze your feet," Tobias said, holding out her boots. "The ground's near solid." She took them with a quiet thank you, sliding them on as he waited. His shirt was buttoned high, collar still damp from washing, and a wool vest hung open over his chest. He smelled faintly of wood smoke and the salted pork he'd started cooking before sunrise. "I'll help with the drying rack," she offered. "If you've got the line." He led her around the side of the cabin where a length of cord stretched between two posts. A shallow tin pail of clothespins rested atop a stump. "You always rise before the light?" she asked. "Habit," he said, handing her a towel. "When I lived farther north, snow came early. If the roof needed patching and I waited till midday, the sun might not show at all." She draped the towel over the line, smoothing the edge. "You've lived in more places than I thought." "I tried to outrun Missouri for longer than I care to admit." She looked over at him. "You ever find anywhere that felt like home?" He paused, his hand on the second towel. "Not until now." She didn't reply, just reached for another cloth. The silence between them wasn't heavy. It felt lived in, like something earned. By late morning, Oliver had pulled on his wool coat and was trailing Tobias toward the small shed behind the barn. Bria stood at the door, watching the boy's eager steps and Tobias's measured gait, the way he slowed so Oliver could keep pace. "He's been itching to see what's in there since he spotted it," Tobias called back. "You mind if I show him?" She shook her head. "So long as he stays clear of anything sharp." The shed housed Tobias's tools, saws, chisels, a plane worn smooth from years of use. Oliver's eyes widened at the hand drill, and Tobias crouched beside him, showing how to brace it against the wood and keep the pressure steady. Bria turned back inside where Olivia was kneeling by the hearth, arranging her 3 carved animals in a circle. Bria knelt beside her, smiling at the careful placement of each one. "Did you name them?" she asked. Olivia pointed. "That one's June. That one's Mr. And that one's just mine." Bria kissed her daughter's hair, then rose and moved to the cupboard. She pulled down the flour tin and set about kneading dough, her sleeves rolled high, the rhythmic press and turn of her hands grounding her. By the time the loaf was rising near the hearth, Tobias and Oliver returned, sawdust clinging to their sleeves. He's got good hands, Tobias said, brushing off his cuffs. Patient ones. Bria glanced at her son. That's from his father. Tobias didn't press. He simply nodded and stepped aside so Oliver could rush forward, holding out a small block of wood with a half-shaped horse etched into it. You did that? Bria asked. With Tobias, he said proudly. He showed me how. She crouched and examined the grain. It's lovely, sweetheart. That afternoon, they walked into the timberline together, Tobias leading the way with a canvas sack slung over his shoulder. He pointed out chokecherry shrubs and a stand of quaking aspen starting to turn. Olivia perched on Bria's hip, her head resting on her mother's shoulder. Oliver ran ahead, doubling back every few minutes to point out mushrooms or overturned logs. Tobias stopped by a fallen tree and pulled out a thick wool blanket from his sack, spreading it over the moss. He knelt and began unpacking the rest bread, cheese, a jar of pickled carrots, and a tin of dried apples. You packed a picnic, Bria said, surprised. You all needed air, he said quietly, and I figured you'd eaten enough indoors for now. She studied him a moment. You're not how I remember, his brow rose slightly. How did you remember me? Wounded, she said. Distant, like you were always bracing for something, he nodded once. I was. And now, I'm trying not to be. They sat on the blanket as the children picked through pine cones nearby. Bria leaned back on her palms, face tilted toward the thin warmth of the sun. Tobias watched her, his gaze steady but unassuming. You want to stay? He asked, voice low. She didn't open her eyes. I haven't decided, I know. I'm not afraid of hard work, she said. But I'm tired of being afraid of everything else. I won't give you reason to be, he said. Not ever. She turned to him, her voice softer. I believe you mean that now, but promises don't hold up to time, Tobias. I've seen that. He looked down at his hands. I can't change the years we lost. But I can build something better than the past we had. She looked away, thoughtful, then reached for a bit of bread and handed it to him. Then start by eating. He smiled faintly, accepting it without another word. By the time they walked back to the cabin, the sun had dipped low, and Olivia had fallen asleep in Bria's arms. Tobias took Oliver's hand without being asked, guiding him over the uneven ground. Inside, the fire had burned low. Tobias added a log with care, then glanced at Bria. You should take the bed again tonight. I'll keep to the floor. She stood in the doorway, Olivia still against her shoulder, her expression unreadable. I don't need space from you, she said. Not the kind that puts you on the floor. He looked at her, surprised. You sure? I'm sure of that, she said. Just stay near. He moved the blanket from the floor without a word and laid it beside the bed instead. Later, as the fire dimmed and the children's breathing deepened, Bria turned to face him in the dark. I didn't think anyone would ever come for me, she whispered. Tobias reached for her hand beneath the quilt, his fingers wrapping around hers, warm and certain. I did, he said. And I'm still here. The first true snow came on a Tuesday, drifting down in slow, heavy flakes that caught in Bria's hair as she hauled water from the well. Tobias had spent the morning banking the cabin's outer walls with pine branches and extra thatch, his movements careful and methodical. The children watched from the window, their breath clouding the glass. Inside, the warmth clung to everything, fresh bread cooling on the table, the faint scent of beeswax from a newly dipped candle, the pop of sap in the hearth logs. Bria had begun sewing again, her needle steady as she hemmed Oliver's trousers by the light of the window. Tobias had cleared a space on the far wall for her sewing box and a chair, without asking, without comment. That afternoon, while the children napped, Tobias set a pot of venison stew on the coals and leaned against the frame of the door, arms crossed loosely. I'll be riding into town tomorrow, he said. Need to settle accounts at the feed store before winter comes in too hard. I'll be back before nightfall, Bria nodded, folding the trousers neatly. Do you want me to write a list for the dry goods? I already did, he said. But you can look it over, see if I forgot anything. She rose and crossed to the small shelf where he kept his ledgers. The list was written in his neat, square-hand: flour, salt, lamp oil, and a bolt of muslin marked with a question beside it. She tapped the paper. "The muslin? I wasn't sure if you'd be needing more." "I will," she said, then hesitated. "You remembered the size I use. You keep your scraps in that tin by the stove," he said, voice quiet. "It wasn't hard to measure one." She folded the list closed and turned to face him fully. "You pay attention to things most men overlook," he shrugged, but didn't look away. "I didn't used to. I'm trying to now." "I see that." He held her gaze for a breath longer, then dipped his head slightly and returned to the stew. The next morning broke clear, the snow packed into a thin crust beneath the trees. Tobias saddled the gelding early, wrapped a scarf around his neck, and kissed Olivia's forehead before lifting himself into the saddle. He looked down at Bria, his expression unreadable under the brim of his hat. "If I'm not back by dusk, wait till morning. Could be the pass gets iced by sundown." "You be careful," she said. "I always am," he replied. "Now." He hesitated, then reached down and touched her hand, just a brush, calloused skin against hers. Then he rode. The hours passed slowly. Bria kept herself busy with work, but her eyes flicked often to the window. By late afternoon, the sky had darkened under a low stretch of clouds, and the wind picked up again, rattling the shutters. She lit the lamp early and set another log on the fire. Just before the light failed, hooves crunched outside. She pressed her hand to the window. Tobias dismounted stiffly, his coat dusted in frost, and walked straight to the door, his breath clouding before him. "You made it," she said, relief softening her voice. "I told you I would." He handed her the sack, then removed his coat and shook the snow from it. His cheeks were red from wind, his hands raw. She took one without thinking, pulling him closer to the fire. "You need warming more than that stew does," she murmured. He didn't pull away. "You've done a lot in a short while," he said. "This place feels different." Bria looked at the children, curled together under a quilt near the hearth. "We're trying to belong, you already do." She met his eyes and for the first time didn't look away. Later, when the children were asleep, Tobias took out a wrapped parcel from his saddlebag and set it in her hands. "From the mercantile," he said simply. She unwrapped the brown paper, revealing a set of bone buttons and a folded length of blue calico. Her breath caught. "I thought it would suit you," he said. "That color." Bria touched the fabric, then looked up at him. "You didn't have to." "I wanted to." She stood in the quiet and crossed the floor to where he sat. Tobias rose as she approached. She placed the fabric on the table behind him, then reached up and brushed snowmelt from his hair. "You do more with silence than most men do with speeches," she said. He rested his hand lightly at her waist, his voice low. "And you say more with your eyes than I ever could with words." Bria leaned in, her forehead just touching his. "I'm not afraid here anymore." "Then stay," he breathed. "Stay for good. I already have." And when she kissed him, it wasn't rushed or uncertain. It was steady, warm, and full of the quiet decision she'd made long before she'd spoken the words aloud. Outside, snow drifted in soft sheets across the hills. Inside, the cabin glowed with a light that no storm could touch. Spring thaw came slowly, dripping through the eaves and softening the rutted path that led from the cabin down to the river bend. Tobias had started clearing the lower field, breaking up the ice-heavy soil with the iron plow he'd kept tarped through the worst of winter. Bria had begun stitching new work dresses from the calico he'd brought months back, and the children took to chasing each other through the slush between chores, boots caked in mud, cheeks flushed from the wind. The days stretched longer now, and there was light enough after supper for sitting out on the porch, the wood still radiating the heat of the sun. Tobias had built a bench there, wide enough for two, with a high back and smooth arms sanded down to a polish. Bria often brought her mending out with her, needle flashing in the low light while Tobias whittled or simply sat quiet beside her, one leg stretched out, the other hooked beneath. "I've been thinking," he said one evening, his knife paused mid-cut against the length of pine in his hands. Bria glanced over, squinting slightly in the last of the light. That's always a dangerous start. He gave a low chuckle. I meant about the land. There's a quarter-acre west of the ridge that's still good. If I put up a fence this season, we could keep goats. She set her sewing down. Goats, for milk mostly, and they'll eat what the chickens won't. Wouldn't take much to build shelter for 'em. She leaned back, considering. You always speak like there'll be time enough for everything. There will be if we make it. Bria turned toward him fully. You said once you didn't know what home felt like. Do you now? Tobias looked out at the trees where the branches had begun to show the barest hint of bud. It's where you wake up knowing no one's coming to take what matters. She reached out, her fingers brushing his wrist. Then we'll keep building it. They married one morning in late April, beneath the cottonwoods by the river, when the water still ran high and fast with snowmelt. There was no preacher nearby, but Tobias had written to a circuit rider over the winter, and the man arrived on horseback with a small Bible wrapped in oilcloth and a worn set of boots that had seen better years. Oliver found 3 feathers from a hawk that morning and tucked them into Tobias's vest pocket before the vows. Olivia picked wild crocus and held them tight in her small fist, handing them to Bria just before the rider began to speak. There were no guests, no music, no supper laid out on long tables. Just the 4 of them standing in the open air, the river rushing past behind them and the sound of wind threading through the trees. Tobias held her hands carefully, like he knew the weight of what he was asking. I won't ever leave you again, he said. Not for war, not for fear, not for anything. Bria's voice didn't shake. And I won't ever run from the life we're building, even when it's hard. The rider spoke the words that made it official, then stepped back, his smile quiet and worn. Tobias gathered Bria close, one hand cradling the back of her head, and kissed her with the steadiness of a man who'd spent years learning what it meant to love without hope, and now had it. That night they sat by the hearth again, firelight flickering across the walls. The children slept nearby, Olivia curled around one of her carved animals, Oliver breathing slow and even beneath the quilt. Bria rested her head against Tobias's shoulder. He had taken to reading aloud in the evenings, his voice low, and even as he moved through the pages of a leather-bound collection of folk tales he'd found in town the month before. She closed her eyes as he read, not because she was tired, but because the sound of him, the steady cadence, the warmth had become something she trusted beyond reason. When he paused, she whispered, You think we'll grow old here? He turned a page. I think we already started. Years passed. The goats came, and the shelter was built. Tobias added another room to the cabin, just wide enough for a proper bed and space for a cradle that would one day rock gently beside it. Bria taught Olivia to stitch, and Oliver grew tall enough to harness the mule without help. Neighbors came to know them the Hartleys, they said, solid folk, kind and quiet. Bria's dresses were sought after in town, and Tobias's hands built fences and furniture that never failed. Seasons turned, snow melted, and the garden stretched farther each spring. They planted an apple tree by the porch, and by the 5th year it bore fruit. One evening, long after the children had run off to the river with their fishing lines, Bria and Tobias sat once more on the bench he'd made. She rested her hands on her growing middle, the child within shifting gently beneath her palm. Tobias reached across and laid his hand over hers. We made it, he said. Bria smiled, leaning into him. And we'll keep making it. Every day. The sun dipped low, painting the sky in streaks of lavender and gold. The land stretched out before them, familiar and full of promise. And in that quiet place, where war and hunger and sorrow no longer reached, Tobias and Bria sat side by side, their lives woven together like thread through cloth sturdy and warm, with nothing left unfinished.